August 2nd, 1943. Blackett Strait. A strip of black water in the Solomon Islands where the ocean seemed to swallow sound. 15 American PT boats waited in the dark with 60 torpedoes, radar on the lead boats, and the kind of confidence that looks impressive on a briefing map. They knew a Japanese destroyer force was coming. They knew the route. They knew the time. They knew that if the ambush worked, the Tokyo Express would finally learn to fear something smaller than a destroyer. Then the torpedoes ran, 30 of them, white wakes sliding through moonless water, and not one hit, not one. The Japanese ships kept moving. American boats lost contact. Radios stepped on each other. Crews in the rear were suddenly blind because the radar boats had already fired and turned away. Then, out of the dark, the destroyer Amagiri appeared like a wall. PT-109 was cut in half. Gasoline spread across the surface. Men were thrown into the water. A young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy and his crew disappeared into the night. That should have been the end of the Navy's faith in wooden torpedo boats. A failed ambush, a shattered hull, 30 torpedoes wasted, and proof, apparently, that little boats had no business hunting warships in the dark. But the strange thing about Blackett Strait is this. The disaster did not kill the PT boat program. It explained it. Because on that night the Navy finally learned the real problem. The boats were fast enough. The crews were brave enough. The torpedoes were dangerous enough. The missing weapon was not wood, speed, or firepower. It was information. And once the Navy understood that, the smallest warships in the Pacific began to change the shape of the war. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Pacific looked like before anyone took the Mosquito fleet seriously. After Pearl Harbor, Japan moved across the map with terrifying speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. Wake, Guam, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. One position after another vanished under the same pressure. By the middle of 1942, Japanese planners were operating across millions of square miles of ocean, and their supply routes through the Solomon Islands had become a nightly machine. American Marines on Guadalcanal called it the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers would run down New Georgia Sound after dark, deliver men, food, ammunition, and fuel, then vanish before daylight exposed them to American aircraft. These were not clumsy supply ships, they were fast destroyers, hard to hit, heavily armed, crewed by sailors who had trained for night fighting with a seriousness most Allied officers did not fully appreciate until they were already losing ships. Their torpedoes reached farther than American commanders thought possible. Their optics were better. Their night doctrine was sharper. And in the narrow waters between islands, their confidence was justified. Every night the Express ran, the situation on Guadalcanal became more dangerous. Food ran short. Ammunition ran short. Malaria did not wait for strategy. Marines were fighting with bodies that were already breaking down, while the destroyers that fed Japanese positions kept cutting through the dark almost on schedule. American cruisers and destroyers tried to stop them. Sometimes they won, often they paid. The battles around Savo Island and Guadalcanal had already taught Washington a brutal lesson. Steel size did not guarantee control of the night. Submarines were too slow to catch many of the fast runs. Aircraft struggled to find targets in darkness and weather. Minefields could be avoided. Conventional answers kept running into the same problem. The Japanese were not crossing open daylight water. They were sprinting through shadow, and shadow favored whoever could see first. That was where the PT boat entered the argument. On paper, the PT boat looked almost insulting. A wooden hull, roughly 80 feet long in its most famous form. 3 Packard gasoline engines, a crew of about 12 men, machine guns, a few heavier weapons as the war went on, and torpedoes that were supposed to let a boat the size of a dockside launch threaten a warship that outweighed it many times over. At speed, a PT boat could run at roughly 40 knots. It could hide in water too shallow for destroyers. It could pull into island coves by daylight and come out after sunset. It cost a fraction of a destroyer. It could be built by American yards that were not set up to build capital ships. To supporters, this was the future. Cheap speed multiplied. To traditional officers, it looked like a dare written by a mechanic. Wooden boats against destroyers. Gasoline tanks under machine gun fire. Torpedoes that did not always behave. Crews so young that some had learned the ocean and the war at the same time. One officer compared the idea to sending bicycles against tanks. The insult stuck because it sounded true. Until John D. Bulkley made it harder to laugh. Bulkley was not built like a committee man. He was a Naval Academy graduate with a reputation for pushing machinery harder than other officers thought sensible. And he had the one quality bureaucracies find exhausting in peacetime and useful in disaster. He would not let go. Before the war, motor torpedo boats were a small, underfunded corner of the Navy. A place for experiments, a place for enthusiasts, a place ambitious officers were warned not to stay too long if they wanted serious careers. Bulkley wanted the boats anyway. He understood their weakness. He understood their unreliability. But he also understood something many larger ship officers did not want to admit. A destroyer is powerful only where it can bring that power to bear. In reefs, shoals, broken island shadows, and moonless channels, size could become hesitation. Speed could become armor. Surprise could become a broadside. When the Philippines came under attack in December 1941, Bulkley commanded Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. 6 boats, 72 men, almost nothing else, against the weight of a Japanese advance that was swallowing the islands. He attacked because there was no more impressive option left. The early reports that came out of those actions were larger than the truth in places, and the Navy would later understand that some claims had been overcredited. But that does not change the part that mattered. Bulkley's boats operated when almost nothing else could. They moved through blockade water. They harassed an enemy that expected safety at night. They became, for a brief and desperate period, one of the only American naval forces still punching back in the Philippines. Then came the order that made Bulkley famous. General Douglas MacArthur had to leave Corregidor. Aircraft could not do it safely. Surface ships could not break through. The path was too exposed, too watched, too dangerous. So MacArthur, his family, and his staff were loaded onto PT boats. 4 wooden boats ran hundreds of miles through Japanese-controlled waters in weather so punishing that men later remembered the trip less as an escape than as a long collision with the sea. They made it. MacArthur reached Australia. Bulkley received the Medal of Honor. And suddenly the officer who had been arguing for small boats was no longer just another nuisance in a file room. He had leverage, but leverage is not doctrine. A medal can open a door. It cannot teach 15 boats how to attack one convoy in total darkness. That lesson had to be learned in the Solomons. And it was learned badly at first. By 1943, PT squadrons were working from advanced island bases with names that sounded small on paper and felt like the edge of the world to the men living there. Tulagi, Rendova, Treasury, Green Island. Makeshift docks, rotting planks, jungle heat, gasoline drums, mosquitoes thick enough to make sleep feel like a negotiation. Mechanics working under canvas with hands permanently blackened by oil. Crews lying on damp bunks in the afternoon, trying to rest before another night run. The boats were loved by the men who understood them, and cursed by the men who had to keep them alive. The engines were powerful, but they drank fuel. The hulls were fast, but they took punishment badly. Salt water crawled into everything. Electrical gear failed, torpedoes missed, radios failed at the exact moment clarity mattered, and the Japanese did not oblige American theories by behaving like targets. The first lesson was humiliating. Speed without coordination is just noise. A PT boat could sprint across black water at 40 knots, but if the crew did not know exactly where the target was, it was simply moving quickly through uncertainty. That was what the Blackett Strait ambush proved. 15 boats had looked overwhelming on a planning board. In the water, they became separated fragments. The radar-equipped section leaders fired first, then turned away. The boats behind them were left with darkness, confusion, and no clean picture of the enemy. The attack produced no torpedo hits. The Japanese destroyer line survived. PT-109 was lost, and the men who came back had to live with the knowledge that bravery had not been the missing ingredient. They had plenty of bravery. They lacked a system. That sentence hurt because it blamed everyone and no one. It blamed doctrine. It blamed equipment. It blamed assumptions. It blamed the belief that courage plus speed would somehow solve geometry. It would not. A torpedo fired from the wrong angle is only a loud hope. A fast boat arriving late is only a witness. A radio net where everyone talks is the same as silence. The officers who wanted the PTs pushed back to coastal patrol now had their evidence. What had the little boats actually proved? They had failed to stop a destroyer force. They had spent expensive torpedoes. They had lost a boat and nearly lost a future president, though no one knew that last part would matter. The old argument returned with sharper teeth. Maybe the boats were too fragile. Maybe the crews were too green. Maybe the weapon belonged in propaganda more than combat. Maybe the Mosquito fleet had finally met the fly swatter. But hidden inside that failure was the first clean diagnosis. The radar boats had seen. The attack boats had not. That difference was everything. If the boats could be organized around seeing instead of merely charging, the equation changed. A PT squadron did not need every boat to behave like a lone hero. It needed scouts. It needed bearings. It needed radio discipline. It needed crews who understood that the first boat to see the enemy was not always the boat that should fire. That was a very different kind of war, less glamorous, more technical, more patient, and far more dangerous to the Japanese. The solution arrived in pieces, not in one dramatic invention. Not in one genius standing over a blueprint while the Navy suddenly understood the future. It came from radar technicians, squadron commanders, mechanics, and exhausted crews who had learned what failure sounded like through headphones. Early PT radar had been crude and uneven. But as more boats received dependable surface search radar, especially compact sets that could detect ships in darkness at useful ranges, the PT crews began to build a new method. One or two boats could move forward quietly and find the convoy. Those boats did not have to fire first. They could hold contact. They could pass bearing, range, and speed to attack boats waiting in better water. The attackers could approach from shallow angles destroyers did not want to enter. They could launch and disappear before the heavier ships understood where the strike had come from. The weapon was no longer just the torpedo. It was the information chain: scout, track, report, intercept, fire, breakaway. That sounds simple only because it is clean on a page. At sea, it required a level of discipline the early PT actions had not always shown. A boat running too soon could expose the whole line. A radio transmission at the wrong time could give away position. A radar operator who misread land clutter as a ship could send torpedoes into nothing. A commander who wanted a kill too badly could ruin the setup. And there was another problem. The original torpedoes were old, heavy, and often unreliable. The Mark 8 had been designed for a different kind of naval war. On PT boats, it created problems crews understood with bitter intimacy. Later roll-off racks and improved aerial torpedoes made the boats lighter and the launch sequence cleaner. That was not a minor adjustment. Weight mattered, flash mattered, reliability mattered. A small boat is not forgiving. Every pound, every spark, every second in range can become the difference between a clean run and a burning hull. As the boats changed, their mission changed too. Destroyers were still the dramatic prize, but barges became the daily war. When Japanese daylight shipping became too vulnerable to aircraft, supplies moved at night in shallow draft barges hugging the coast. Destroyers could not always protect them. Larger American ships could not always reach them. PT boats could. They became barge busters. Not because it sounded heroic in newspapers, but because the work attacked the war where it was most vulnerable. Food, fuel, ammunition, replacement troops, the dull bloodstream of an army. A ship sunk in a headline is dramatic. A barge destroyed quietly at 2 in the morning can starve a battalion 2 weeks later. That was the part civilians rarely understood. The PT boat did not have to win a fleet battle to matter. It had to make resupply unreliable. It had to make Japanese commanders spend escorts, fuel, time, and nerves just to move cargo through water they had once treated as routine. It had to turn a schedule into a gamble. By late 1943, the Japanese were adapting. They were not fools. They understood patterns. They added guns to barges. They watched for wakes. They used shore batteries, flares, aircraft, and ambush points. In some places, the little boats became the hunted. A PT boat hit by direct fire could burn with terrifying speed. Gasoline did not offer nobility. It offered flame. The crews knew this every time they went out. They joked because that was easier than naming it. They painted names on hulls. They modified guns. They argued with mechanics. They slept in heat. Then at dusk they stepped aboard wooden boats full of fuel and went looking for men trying to kill them. The romance of the Mosquito fleet looks better from a museum floor than it did from the cockpit. Inside the war, it was noise, sweat, bad coffee, engine vibration, and the constant knowledge that the ocean around you was bigger than your luck. But the doctrine kept improving because survival demanded it. Radar operators learned the difference between land and steel. Skippers learned to hold fire longer. Squadrons learned not to crowd the same target. Crews learned that a clean withdrawal was part of the attack, not an admission of fear. Mechanics learned which failures came from design and which came from salt, heat, vibration, and punishment. The system matured the way wartime systems usually do, not by elegance, by loss. One damaged boat at a time, one corrected bearing at a time, one crew that did not come home, one crew that did, and explained what had gone wrong. That is the hidden story behind the PT boat. The famous version says little wooden boats took on giant ships. The better version says the Navy had to unlearn its own romance about bravery. The boat was never enough. The torpedo was never enough. The young crew was never enough. The advantage came when all of those things were connected by information and discipline. That was the real revolution. Not smallness, networked smallness. A destroyer captain looking into black water was no longer facing one wooden boat. He was facing scouts he could not see, attack craft he could not predict, radar bearings he did not know were being passed, and shallow water that turned his own size into a restriction. He was facing an enemy that had stopped trying to beat him like a smaller destroyer. That was the breakthrough. The PT boat did not become powerful by pretending to be a big ship. It became powerful by becoming something a big ship could not be: fast, distributed, hard to see, hard to pin, close to shore, able to strike at logistics instead of pride, able to make the night expensive. The effect spread through the campaign in a way that rarely appears in clean battle summaries. Japanese garrisons became harder to feed. Night supply runs demanded more caution. Barges replaced ships where ships became too risky. Submarines carried cargo inefficiently where surface routes were too dangerous. Men at the front felt the result before headquarters admitted it. Fewer shells, less rice, less fuel, more delays, more improvisation, more hunger. Wars are often remembered by the moments when something explodes. They are often decided by the nights when something does not arrive. By the time the Pacific War moved beyond the Solomons, PT boats had taken on a wider range of missions. They rescued downed airmen, carried raiders, laid smoke, destroyed mines, harassed coastal traffic, guided larger operations through confusing water. In New Guinea and the Philippines, they attacked barges and small craft so relentlessly that the Japanese came to treat them as a serious threat, not a nuisance. By the end of the war, hundreds of PT boats had been built. Most would not survive as relics. Wooden war machines do not age like battleships. Many were burned, scrapped, abandoned, or sold. That feels almost disrespectful until you remember what they were designed to be. Not monuments, tools, fast tools for a war that had discovered the value of small things connected correctly. And Bulkeley's own career did not end with the wooden boats. He stayed in the Navy for decades. He rose to vice admiral. He served through new wars, new technologies, and new arguments about what the Navy should become. The institution that once doubted the Mosquito fleet eventually absorbed the lesson in a quieter form. Speed mattered. Sensors mattered. Small combatants mattered. A vessel did not need the largest gun in the ocean if it could find, coordinate, strike, and vanish before the opponent brought weight to bear. That lesson would reappear in fast attack craft, in river warfare, in coastal interdiction, in missile boats, in every later argument where a smaller platform asked a larger institution a dangerous question. What if seeing first matters more than being biggest? The most revealing detail is still the disaster at the beginning. Blackett Strait, 15 boats, 30 torpedoes fired, no hits. PT-109 cut in half. That failure is usually remembered because of Kennedy, but its deeper meaning belongs to the whole Mosquito fleet. It showed the Navy exactly what courage could not fix. It showed that speed without information was a myth. It showed that bravery, multiplied by confusion, could still become loss. And it forced the men who believed in the boats to make a harder argument than the one they wanted. Not, "Trust us, we are bold." Not, "Trust us, we are fast." But, "Give us a system. Give us radar that works. Give us radios that are used with discipline. Give us torpedoes that fit the job. Give us tacks that treat darkness as a battlefield, not a curtain. Give us permission to stop fighting like tiny destroyers and start fighting like the thing only we can be." That was the argument that changed everything. Not overnight, not cleanly, not without dead men and burned boats, but enough. Enough to turn Japanese supply routes into hazards. Enough to make commanders reconsider waters they had once crossed with confidence. Enough to prove that a dismissed weapon can become decisive when someone finally understands what problem it is meant to solve. The Pacific did not belong to the largest hulls alone. It belonged at night to whoever could see, decide, and move before the other side understood the shape of the attack. The PT boat was never the biggest weapon in the war. It was never the safest. It was never the cleanest idea in the room. It was wood, gasoline, engines, young men, imperfect torpedoes, and radar screens glowing in wet darkness. But for the Japanese crews trying to move supplies through island channels, that was enough to turn the night against them. And that is why the most dangerous thing in the slot was not the boat. It was the moment the Navy stopped asking how big a ship was and started asking what it could see.